I'd love to introduce to you, we're so grateful to have Dana Gelb-Safran join us, who's President and CEO of the National Quality Forum. Her bio is on the microsite, but just briefly, I think she brings a wonderful intersection of both academic and business insight to issues related to quality outcomes and affordability. And it's the reason why we invited her to speak to us today. For those of you that know her, she comes from a background of having worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield in Massachusetts, and I think she'll share a little bit of her learnings from that time. She also most recently was with Haven and Well Health. So she brings, I think, a really well-rounded view of this question, and I think a passion, as I have and IVI has, for patient-centeredness in this discussion. Please help me welcome Dr. Safran.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that warm and lovely introduction, Jen. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to address this gathering, virtual though it may be. And I think that the remarks that Jen and Rick have teed up have really been a wonderful stage setting for your meeting over these couple of days, and also for the remarks that I wanted to share with you. I really want in these few minutes to talk with you a bit about, Rick mentioned, we're drowning in patient data. We might say data and measures everywhere and not a drop to drink. But I really want to talk about that issue of how we get to the next generation of measures and methods that we need to advance value in healthcare. So if we could go to the next slide. What is represented here is, I think the problem to solve is that advancing value, whether through value-based payment, which as folks know has been a big part of my orientation, or the kind of value-based research to identify the most appropriate treatments, which I know is the focus of many in this audience. Either way requires measures of outcomes to inform that equation of cost and quality or outcomes. And what's represented here is the fact that there are 5 major clinical areas for which we have as a nation no good outcome measures, not one, or if one, then only 1 or 2 outcome measures. And yet these represent more than 50% of the commercial spend, and also more than 50% for Medicare and Medicaid. So these are just absolutely critical gaps in our portfolio of measures. And this was an issue that I had to confront head on in my role at Blue Cross Massachusetts, where I had developed a measure set to be paired with our value-based payment model, a global budget model called the Alternative Quality Contract. And while that measure set was more robust than any that had preceded it and really set the stage for a lot of how value-based contracts are handled today, it had these glaring deficiencies. And I'll speak a little bit more about some work we did to try to solve that, and how I hope at NQF to build on that work to accelerate solving that issue of next-gen measures and next-gen measure architecture. But first, if we just take a look at the next slide, it provides, I think, a framework that's valuable for the work that this group is doing. Comes from some work that I participated in with the Healthcare Payment Learning and Action Network back in 2016. And what we were meaning to convey here was that we had, for the most part, what we called little dot measures in our nation's portfolio of measures, lots and lots of measures of process, which in a sense you can think of as a perfect byproduct of fee-for-service payment, right? You do a thing, you measure the thing. You do another thing, you measure the other thing. And what value-based payment really calls for, we said, was big dot measures. Ideally, one big dot measure for each of the 3 domains that constitute the triple aim. But understanding that while we have such a measure, total cost of care in the cost domain, we might not get to anytime soon a single big dot measure representing quality or health. So we should at least find some big dot measures that can roll up to those. And so what I'll share with you next is some work that I did at Blue Cross Mass and the learnings from that that lead to some work I hope NQF will be able to do to accelerate progress on getting to the big dot measures that we need for value-based payment and value assessment more broadly. So what is represented on this slide are each dot represents a patient who had a hip replacement surgery. And starting in 2013, because Blue Cross was seeing none of the big dot measures that we needed coming through the NQF pipeline, and because I myself had a measure development background, and we had a network of providers who would collaborate with us as a laboratory for measure development, we decided to take matters into our own hands and do some work on developing next-gen measures that could help fill some of those 5 clinical priority gaps. And where we started was with depression and with hip and knee pain, and with the implementation of PROMs for each of those domains. And what we learned was really quite profound. And this slide, I think, illustrates it well. On the x-axis was the baseline functional status of patients who ultimately went on to have a hip replacement surgery. And on the y-axis is how much change occurred after that surgery in the 1 year following the surgery. And what you'll notice is a set of red dots, which represent patients for whom the surgery did not accomplish any gain, and in fact, in many cases did harm. And you'll notice that there is a baseline score in the 70s where there is over 90% certainty that there will not be a good outcome from this surgery. And at the same time, there is a baseline score in the 40s and below, the green dots, where there is near certainty that the surgery will help drive improvement in functional status for that patient. Now you can see there are many dots that are grayed out where we need more information than just the single baseline score, but it turned out that for 40% of patients who had a hip replacement surgery, we could know with greater than 90% certainty whether that surgery would help them or potentially harm them. And for 8% of patients who are the red dots, I would say it is outrageous that we aren't doing this kind of measurement to inform our decision-making around treatments. This kind of work has been replicated with the same patterns displayed for every area of musculoskeletal care. And so how do we take this and advance this kind of work to the types of value assessments that you need for what you do and that value-based payment contracts really require? The only bad part of the Blue Cross story that I could share is after 5 years, we still did not have that outcome measure that we were ready to submit to NQF for endorsement or to incorporate into our contracts, which leads to the idea that I'll share with you very briefly on the next slide. This is just an idea. Next slide, please. This is just an idea at this point, one that we are talking with payers and purchasers about, both public and private sector payers, and getting a lot of enthusiastic response. But the idea here is to convene payer and purchaser innovators, activists who really want to solve the next gen measure problem, and work with them to align on what are 2 or 3 places to start, clinical areas where an outcome measure is absolutely just a critical gap, and there's a sense of urgency about developing it. once we have aligned on those priority areas, convene patients to understand from their perspective as somebody with that condition or somebody who has had that procedure, what was the single most important outcome, health outcome, that they really wanted, expected the healthcare system to deliver to them. And then proceed to either develop such a measure, having a measure developer working on it, or if such a measure already exists as a starting point, to implement it at scale through this coalition of innovators so that we can really shorten the time that it takes to develop, test, and validate next generation measures. And importantly, this same platform and framework can be used to implement new types of data collection, as Rick mentioned, not just PROMs, but for example, the data that we'll need to really advance health equity, having patient-reported data on race, ethnicity, and other variables that we will need for that work. This platform of activist innovators can really enable that work at scale as well. And also the large-scale testing of next-generation data infrastructure, the uses of the clinical record for measurement, either for measures that have heretofore been claims-based, and we want to transition to clinically sourced data, or for new next-gen measures, using, for example, bulk FHIR to be able to export at the population level the data elements needed for the work of a coalition like this. So if you in the audience are measure developers, if you are payers, if you are purchasers, you are any player in the ecosystem who finds this important and exciting and would like to explore being part of being an activist innovator in doing this work, we would love to hear from you. I'll conclude and then open for a couple of questions with one final slide that displays. Can you go to the next slide, please? That displays where NQF aims to be going. In 2020, December of 2020, NQF published a new 5-year strategic plan that envisions us continuing with excellence to serve the core functions that have been our work for over 20 years, the endorsement and maintenance process, the conduct of the measures application partnership through which CMS works to identify which measures it will incorporate into its programs, and the core quality measures collaborative, a public-private partnership for aligning on which measures get into value-based contracts. But we will move upstream from that to help establish alignment around priority gaps in measurement, to accelerate the development of those measures, as we were just talking about, to leverage next generation measure infrastructure, advancing digital quality measures, and very importantly, incorporating patient and family voices into what are the priorities, how do we develop measures that matter to patients, and have them at the table long before they're invited to come and consider endorsement of measures in that core set of functions. And then finally, the downstream work of how we apply endorsed measures to help advance better quality outcomes, equity, and affordability through new payment models, transparency, product design, and the important work that all of you do in value assessment of actual treatments and therapies to understand which ones are best and for whom. So with that, I would welcome, if we have a moment, a couple of questions from the audience, and then send you on your exciting journey for these couple of days of meetings together.
Dana, thank you so much for your remarks. Perfect kickoff, both visually and good challenge for us to tackle. If folks have questions, I think we have time for maybe one or two. I'll tell you mine top of mind. The biggest challenge in tackling this question is prioritization. And you shared a number of pretty big areas where you feel what we're measuring is missing the mark, or we aren't measuring sufficiently. What's your sense of prioritization? I mean, even before you convene all these lovely, innovative people, where do you think is the biggest win possibility that benefits all actors? Is that a place to start?
Yeah, I think, Jennifer, that the biggest win possibility may be in the space of mental health. And I say that for a number of reasons. First is that I understand that the gaps in outcome measures for mental health are tremendous. Um, we have so many process measures for mental health, but really very little insight into outcomes. And mental health has for decades really been treated more as a cottage industry, right? Where there isn't a lot of measurement, there isn't a lot of accountability. One of the reasons that I prioritize it as an area for next gen measure development is that we understand now that the impact of mental health challenges on physical health and well-being, on the spend for healthcare, it is a multiplier. So there's tremendous evidence that for patients with a chronic illness like diabetes or hypertension and comorbid depression or anxiety, there's a multiplier effect on what gets spent on that patient's chronic illness based on their mental health and well-being. So there are so many important reasons to address mental health and improve mental health care, and to begin to build an evidence base that tells us what works and for whom, that I think that would be a critical place to start. The other, I think, would be musculoskeletal conditions, because for commercial payers, these represent a huge aspect of spend, including for procedures that in many cases, as illustrated by the slide that I shared, may not only be expensive, but harmful, not solving the patient's problem. And when patients are impaired in either of these ways, either emotional impairments or physiological ones, it really affects the employer's ability to have that individual giving their best and having productive and effective time at work. So there's so many reasons for all the stakeholders to care about those issues. I'd put those two at the top.
Thanks for that. And I would say my second question is actually being reflected in both the Q&A and the chat, very vigorous chat. Thank you for those who are doing that. And that is, how do you envision NQF integrating patient, family, caregiver, community member insight and input into the priority setting process? Your slide that talked about the activist innovators didn't include patients at that stage. So what's your reflection on how to incorporate that voice in the priority setting phase?
Yeah, that is a really important question. And so, I think that our concept right now, and this could change, is that where patients help us prioritize is for a given clinical area where there is a gap, what is it we should be measuring? What matters to them? And that is a new conversation. Certainly at NQF, patients and consumer advocacy organizations have been at our table, and in fact, our bylaws require them to be them and purchasers to be a majority of our board. But I will say that the core work that you saw represented in that final slide of endorsement and maintenance is not the work that patients or family members really want to engage with. They want to move upstream and be helping us identify what is it we should be measuring, what matters to them. And so that is, while not pictured, and thank you for flagging that important gap in our visual, we will address that because the voiceover always explains how patients are involved. But what I heard in your question that I really want to give some thought to is at the moment, patients are not envisioned to be involved in deciding for which clinical areas are we most lacking measures. We only bring them in once we've identified those areas and say, what would you want us to measure? What was the most important outcome? And I need to give that some thought as to whether, patients can engage with that first question. And I think my only hesitation there is the reality that for the most part, patients um, don't engage so much with the quality measurement enterprise, right? So they're not spending time thinking the way payers and purchasers are about what's missing from our current portfolio of measures, but rather can speak to what's missing from their care. So we have to think about how to incorporate their voices into the priority setting, not just into the establishing what should be measured once we know the priorities where we want to focus.